Today I'm going to show you how I break down references into poses relatively quickly without getting stuck drawing every little detail. The goal here isn't to spend 20 minutes trying to figure out every single pose. Ideally, you should be able to get the important information down in less than 5 minutes, and from there of course you can draw on top. You could call this method that I like to do gesture drawing, but I think that what we're doing here is closer to some type of simplified pose construction. This method can get a little messy when it comes to the sketch, but when we're sketching, in my opinion, I think messy is completely fine as long as the pose is clear. For this video, I'll be drawing 3 different poses and I'll be explaining my thought process as I go. I'll also point out some common mistakes I see people make and a few that I used to make myself, so hopefully you can avoid them. Now, personally, I draw poses by combining 2 different methods. The first method is by using a box mannequin, which if you follow the only video I have about the subject, you'll know that it's pretty much about constructing the major shapes of the body with boxes and cylinders, and then go over them to add muscle mass and anatomy and whatnot. The second method that I like to use is similar to gesture drawing, where I basically just go straight into constructing the pose while following its flow, but as I mentioned before, I at the same time use elements of the box mannequin, so it's like a combination of both. But you'll see what I mean as I go, like I'll promise it will make sense. Now, first off, we want to get a good reference, and by good reference I mean something you can realistically see yourself drawing on your current level. Something like this, for example, might not be the best reference to start with because there's so much overlapping happening in the body, and there's also that weird background that it can become so necessarily difficult for someone at the beginner or intermediate level to do. So instead, let's go with something like this. As always, I like to start with the head. For this exercise, please keep it simple. Make a circle and add a basic jaw shape. That's enough to establish the head. From there, I do something a little different. Before constructing the body, I try to understand the flow of the pose using a few simple lines. I first look at the sternocleidomastoid muscles, the neck muscles, which you see running down from around the ear toward the clavicles. This can be really useful for understanding the direction and rotation of the head. One mistake you want to avoid is always drawing them perfectly centered. If the head turns, their position changes too, and depending on the angle, one may even become partially hidden behind the other. Then I follow the general direction of the clavicles to understand the angle of the shoulders, and after that I draw a center line through the ribcage, which roughly follows the sternum on the front of the body and helps me understand which direction the torso is facing. These lines are only placeholders. They're there to help me understand the movement and orientation of the pose before I start adding actual volume. Once I have that, I construct the ribcage. I generally use boxes to represent the ribcage. I know a lot of people like using ovals. Again, this is a matter of what you're more comfortable with. I like using boxes because it's easier for me, but whatever's best for you, go for that. And with the pelvis, I generally follow the same logic. And yes, I like to use boxes for that too. To do it, you want to really look at the reference, like observe it, and see how the pelvis is flowing away from the ribcage. There's going to be some type of curve to it. And from there, you want to place a simple directional line first, and then build a shape around it. A mistake I used to make a lot when learning was placing the ribcage and pelvis way too far apart. As a very rough guideline, the space between them is often somewhere around half the height of the head. Don't start measuring every pose though. Just use that as a reference and eyeball it until the proportions feel right. Another trick is to temporarily connect the ribcage and pelvis with a simple oval shape representing the abdomen. If that connection looks stretched or strange, the 2 masses might be far apart. The best advice I could give you regarding this is to keep practicing and keep observing your mistakes regarding the placement of the ribcage and the pelvis, because the more you do it, the more you will develop a feeling of the distance that actually feels right between the two. Once I have the ribcage and the pelvis, I usually move on to the legs first. I personally find simple stick lines really useful here because they let me quickly establish the direction, movement, and length of the legs. And because these lines are so simple, correcting them is easy. If the leg looks too short, I can simply move the knee farther down instead of having to erase the entire finished leg. Once the placement looks good, I build cylinders around those lines for the thighs, and I use a simple circle or joint shape for the knees, and then I construct the lower legs. For the lower leg, one landmark I like paying attention to is the tibia, the shin bone, on the front of the leg. From there, you can think about the lower leg as having a subtle zigzag rhythm. The outer side tends to sit higher near the knee, while the inner side travels a little bit lower toward the ankle. That gives you a pretty good simplified shape for the lower leg without getting too deep into anatomy. anatomy. For the feet, I usually keep things extremely simple. You can see the type of shape that I'm using here. It's honestly easier to understand visually at this stage rather than me trying to explain it with different words. But honestly, as long as the shape that you make looks and feels like an actual foot, then it's fine, in my opinion, for the concept of practicing. Now, at this stage, you really just need the direction, length, and basic volume of the feet. I also recommend drawing the legs before the arms. The legs do a lot of the work when it comes to establish the balance and weight of the pose. So once that is working, placing the arm becomes much easier. For the arms, we follow pretty much the same logic. You start with the stick line to establish the direction. Also, it's very helpful to do this when there is foreshortening in the pose because it's actually so simple that you're able to place the figures or the shapes on top of one another without too much of a hassle. So I will always recommend to start with the stick line first before establishing everything else. Once you've done that, we can place the cylinders from the upper arm and forearm, followed by a very basic block shape for the hand. Now, my advice when you have poses with some level of foreshortening like this one, I would recommend to first draw that shape of the hand, and from the hand you try to connect it to the shoulder. I found that to be much more easier than the other way around. And when it comes to the fingers, look, as long as the general gesture of the hand is visible, just don't overcomplicate things, alright? But I do recommend drawing them. Even if they're just a very simple shape like a blob, including the fingers helps you slowly get accustomed to the proportions, direction, and overall flow of hands if that's something you struggle with. Also, something else that for me is really important is to be confident with your lines. Try to think about the stroke before you actually make it. Avoid doing 20 tiny hesitant strokes to create one line because that's only going to make an already messy sketch look even messier. Try to describe the pose using as few strokes as you reasonably can, but at the same time, don't become hyper obsessed with making every single line perfect. You are practicing. The goal is to understand the pose. You're not creating an actual finished line art piece. This approach becomes especially useful when you're dealing with foreshortening. When a pose has body parts coming toward or away from the camera, starting with stick lines and then building this simple 3D shape around them makes the overlapping way easier to understand. It also makes correcting and cleaning up the drawing later much simpler. With foreshortening, remember that parts of the body that are closer to the camera will usually appear larger. One easy way to estimate how large something should be is to compare it with the size of the character's head in the reference. You can be extremely meticulous about these measurements if you want, but personally I usually just eyeball them. And that's really the point of this entire exercise. You're trying to train yourself to look at the reference, understand what the body is doing, simplify that information, and put it down quickly. This is actually one of the exercises that helped me a lot when I was trying to level up my character drawing, and I really recommend trying to keep each pose under 5 minutes. If 5 minutes feels like too much for you, then reduce it, that's completely fine. But if 5 minutes is still not enough, then instead of immediately giving yourself 10 or 20 minutes, I will actually rather recommend for you to try simply a different pose, maybe something that is easier for you. And then try to think about what actually slowed you down, right? Was it the rib cage, the pelvis? Was it the aspect of foreshortening? Was it the hands? Whatever it was, pay extra attention to that problem in the next pose. The idea is not to create one perfect drawing, it's to get through a lot of poses and gradually become faster at understanding them. Personally, the way I draw nowadays is somewhere between the two methods I showed you. Sometimes I use the box mannequin when I really need to understand the perspective, and other times I go directly into this looser construction approach. So experiment with both if you'd like and find whatever works best for you. If you were to ask me, I will always recommend you to use the box mannequin method, but of course, you can do whatever you want. Now, that's pretty much all I have to say. If there's any other drawing topics you'd like me to talk about or make a video about, just leave them down in the comments. Also, sorry for being incredibly inactive the past couple of months. I was working on a comic competition and I actually posted a whole comic here on the channel if you want to check that out. Now, keep drawing, never stop practicing. I'll see you on the next one. May God bless you all. Peace.